The Story of Ancient Irish Civilisation by Patrick Weston Joyce. Chapter 1. How the Ancient Irish People were governed by their kings and chiefs. There were in Ireland, from times beyond the reach of history, kings who were of various grades according to the extent of the country or district they ruled over. The highest of all was the King of Ireland, who lived in the royal palace at Tara. He was called the Ard Rí, or the High King, or Over King, because he claimed authority over all the others. There was also a king over each of the provinces, Leinster, Munster, Connacht, Ulster, and Meath, who were subject to the Ard Rí. The provinces were divided into a number of territories, over which were kings of a still lower grade, each under the king of his own province. If the district was not large enough to have a king, it was ruled by a chief who was subject to the king of the larger territory in which the district was included. The king was always chosen from one particular ruling family, and when a king died, those chiefs who had votes held a meeting lasting for 3 days and 3 nights, at which they elected whatever member of that family they considered the wisest, best, and bravest. After this, a day was fixed for inaugurating the new king, a ceremony corresponding in some respects with the crowning of our present monarchs. This inauguration, or making of a king, as it is called in Irish, was a great affair, and was attended by all the leading people, both clergymen and laymen. There was always one particular spot for the ceremony, on which usually stood a high mound or fort with an inauguration stone on top, and often a great branching old tree under the shade of which the main proceedings were carried on. The new king, standing on the inauguration stone, swore a solemn oath in the hearing of all that he would govern his people with strict justice, and that he would observe the laws of the land and maintain the old customs of the tribe or kingdom. Then he put by his sword, and one of the chiefs, whose special office it was, put into his hand a long, straight white wand. This was to signify that he was to govern not by violence or harshness, but by justice, and that his decisions were to be straight and stainless like the wand. Several other forms had to be gone through till the ceremony was completed, and he was then the lawful king. The old Irish kings lived in great style, especially those of the higher ranks, and, like the kings of our own day, kept in their palaces numbers of persons to attend on them, holding various offices, all with good salaries. The higher the grade of the king, the greater the number of his household, and the grander the persons holding offices. Forming part of his retinue, there were nobles, who did nothing at all but wait on him merely to do him honour. There were ullavs, that is, learned and distinguished men of the several professions, historians, poets, physicians, builders, brehons or judges, musicians, and so forth. All were held in high honour and exercised their several professions for the benefit of the king and his household, for which each had a house and a tract of land free or some other equivalent stipend. Then there was a house steward who issued orders each day for the provisions to be laid in for next day, the number of oxen, sheep, and hogs to be slaughtered, the quantity of bread to be baked, and of ale, mead, and wine to be measured out, and he regulated the reception of guests, their arrangement at banquets, and their sleeping accommodation, with numerous other matters of a like kind all pertaining to the household. His word was law, and no one ever thought of questioning his arrangements. The house steward's office was one of great responsibility, and he had plenty of anxiety and worry, and accordingly he held a high rank and was well paid for his services. There was a champion, a fierce and mighty man, who answered challenges and, when necessary, fought single combats for the honour of the king. Guards were always at hand who remained standing up with drawn swords or battle axes during dinner. There was a master of horse with numerous grooms, keepers of the king's jewels and chessboards, couriers or runners to convey the king's messages and orders and to bring him tidings, keepers of hounds and coursing dogs, a chief swineherd with his underlings, fools, jugglers, and jesters for the amusement of the company, with a whole army of underservants and workmen of various kinds. Each day the whole company sat in the great hall at dinner, arranged at tables in the order of rank, the great grandees and the olives near the king, others of less importance lower down, while the attendants, when they were not otherwise occupied, sat at tables of their own at the lower end of the hall. To pay the expenses of his great household and to enable him to live in grandeur as a king should live, he had a large tract of land free, besides which every tenant and householder throughout his dominion had to make a yearly payment according to his means. These payments were made not in money, for there was little or no coined money then, but in kind. That is to say, cattle and provisions of various sorts, plough oxen, hogs, sheep, with mantles and other articles of dress, also dye-stuffs, sewing thread, firewood, horses, rich bridles, chessboards, jewellery, and sometimes gold and silver reckoned out in ounces. Much income also accrued to the king from other sources not mentioned here, and he wanted it all, for he was expected to be lavish in giving presents, and hospitable without stint in receiving and entertaining guests. Besides all this, the king often went on what was called a free circuit, that is, a visitation through his dominions, moving quite leisurely in his chariot from place to place with a numerous retinue, all in their own chariots, while the several sub-kings through whose territories he passed had to lodge, feed, and entertain the whole company free while they remained. These old Irish kings, when they were not engaged in war, seem to have led a free and easy life, and to have had a pleasanter time of it than the kings and emperors of our own day. The Irish took care that their kings had not too much power in their hands, so they could not always do as they pleased, a proper and wise arrangement. They were what we now call limited monarchs. That is, they could not enter on any important undertaking affecting the kingdom or the public without consulting their people. On such occasions, the king had to call a meeting of his chief men and ask their advice, and if necessary, take their votes when there was a difference of opinion. And besides this, kings, as we shall see farther on, had to obey the law the same as their subjects. Each king, of whatever grade, should, according to law, have at least 3 chief residences, and he lived in them by turns, as suited his fancy or convenience. Nearly all those old palaces are known at the present day, and in most of them the ramparts and mounds are still to be seen, more or less dilapidated after the long lapse of time. The ruins of the most important ones, such as we now see them, are described in some detail in my 2 social histories of ancient Ireland, but here our space will not permit us to mention more than a few. The most important of all is Tara, the chief residence of the Overkings, which is situated on the summit of a gentle green hill 6 miles from Navan in Meath and 2 miles from the Midland Railway station of Kilmessan. The various mounds, circular ramparts, and other features are plainly marked on the plan given at the beginning of this book, and anyone who walks over the hill with the plan in his hand can easily recognise them. Next to Tara in celebrity was the Palace of Awan or Armenia, the residence of the kings of Ulster, and the chief home of Conavar MacNessa and the Red Branch Knights. The imposing remains of this palace, consisting of a great mound surrounded by an immense circular rampart and fosse half obliterated, the whole structure covering about 11 English acres, lie 2 miles west of Armagh. Another Ulster palace, quite as important as Emain, was Ailech, the ruins of which are situated in County Donegal, on the summit of a hill 800 feet high, 5 miles northwest from Derry. It is a circular stone fortress of dry masonry, still retaining its own name in the form of Green and Ailech, the Green and Ailech. The chief palace of the kings of Connacht was Croghan, the old fort of which lies 3 miles from Tulsk in Roscommon. The most important residence of the Leinster kings was Éilinn, now called Knockallin, an immense fort surrounding the summit of a hill near Kilcullen in Kildare. Besides these, there are the Munster palaces, the Rock of Cashel, Kincora at Killaloe, Brewery in Limerick, and Cahir in Tipperary. Also, we have Naas in Kildare, Dunlavin in Wicklow, Dinree in Carlow, and many others. End of chapter. How the Ancient Irish People Were Governed by Their Kings and Chiefs by Patrick Weston Joyce. The Story of Ancient Irish Civilisation by Patrick Weston Joyce. Chapter 2. How the warlike old Irish conquered foreign lands. From the remotest times, the Irish had a genius for war and a love for fighting, and if it fell within the scope of this narrative, it would be easy to show that these features in our character have come down to the present day. For good or for bad, we are, and always have been, a fighting race. In old times, the Scots, as the Irish were then called, were well known for their warlike qualities and very much dreaded, so that fabulous rumours regarding them ran among some of the people of the continent. One Latin writer tells us that Irish mothers were wont to present the first food on the point of a sword to their newly born male infants as a sort of dedication to war. This is certainly an invention, for it is not mentioned in our own records, but it indicates the character the Irish people had earned for themselves abroad. They fought a great deal too much among themselves at home, but in this respect they were not a bit worse than the English people at the time of the Heptarchy or the continental nations of the same period. That the old Irish should be warlike is only what we might expect, seeing that they were in great measure descended from the continental Gauls, who in ancient times were renowned as warriors and conquerors. But mighty as the Gauls were, and though they were at least as brave as the Romans, they were subdued in the end by superior discipline when Julius Caesar invaded them. And so, with the old Irish, though they were fierce and strong, and taken man for man quite a match for the Anglo-Normans, they were forced, after a long struggle, to yield to science, skill, and discipline when they were invaded by that people, then the greatest warriors in the world. The Irish were not content with fighting at home, but made themselves formidable in foreign lands. Their chief foreign conquests were in Wales and Scotland, but they frequently found their way to the continent. Irish literature of every kind abounds in records of foreign raids, invasions, and intermarriages, and in many particulars these native accounts are borne out by authorities that no one questions, namely Roman classical writers, whenever they find occasion to touch on these matters. Those who have read the early history of England will remember that the Picts and Scots, marching southward from the Scottish Highlands, gave much trouble year after year for a long period to the Romans and Britons. The Picts were the people of Scotland at the time, and the Scots were the Irish who, crossing over to Alban or Scotland in their Curragh fleets, joined the Picts in their formidable raids southwards. We know all this not only from our own native historians, but also from Roman writers who tell us how the Romans had often to fight in Britain against the Scots from Ireland. In order to protect the British people against these two fierce nations, the Romans, at different intervals in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, built great walls or ramparts from sea to sea between Britain and Alban, of which the ruins are still to be seen, one beginning at the Frith of Clyde and another at the Solway Frith. For several hundred years, from the 3rd to the 6th century, and even after, the Irish streamed continually to Scotland across the narrow sea. The first of these migrations, of which we have reliable accounts, originated in a famine exactly as the great exodus of our own day from Ireland to America was set going by the terrible famine of 1847. And this migration is related partly by old Irish writers and partly by the great English historian, the Venerable Bede. The famine in question fell on Munster early in the 3rd century, so that numbers of people were forced to leave the province. One particular chief led a great host of fighting men with their families northwards till they reached the extreme district now known as the County Antrim. Here they divided, and while one part remained in Ireland, that is Antrim, the other part, under the same leader mentioned above, crossed over to Alban or Scotland, where they settled down. From this time forward, there was a continual migration year after year from the northern coast to Scotland, till, after the lapse of about 3 centuries, occurred the greatest invasion of all, led by the 3 brothers Fergus, Angus, and Lorne in the year 503. It has already been related in our histories of Ireland, and need not be repeated in detail here, how these colonists ultimately mastered the country over which their first king, Fergus, ruled, how they gave Scotland its name, how the subsequent kings of Scotland were the direct descendants of Fergus, and how from him again through the Stuarts descend, in one of their lines of pedigree, our present royal family. At about the same period the Irish mastered and peopled the Isle of Man, and for centuries there was constant intercourse between the parent people of the northeast coast of Ireland and this little colony. Though the Norsemen wrested the sovereignty of the island from them in the 9th century, they did not succeed in displacing either the Gaelic people or their language. The best possible proof that the Irish colonised and held possession of Man for ages is the fact that the Manx language is nothing more than the Irish Gaelic, slightly changed by lapse of time. There are also still to be seen all over the island Irish buildings and monuments mixed up, however, with many of Norse origin, and the great majority of both the place names and the native family names are Gaelic. In our old historical books we have accounts of migrations of Irish people to Wales, some as invaders intending to return, some as colonists proposing to settle and remain. At this time the Romans were masters of England and Wales, but they were not as mighty a people in the 4th century as they had been previously, for on the continent the northern barbarians were pressing on them everywhere, and in Britain the Picts and Scots, as we have said, kept continually harassing them from the north. These raids became at last so intolerable that the Roman government sent an able general named Theodosius, father of the Emperor Theodosius the Great, to Britain to check them. At the very time that Theodosius was in Britain, a brave and strong-handed king reigned in Tara, named Criffan, from AD 366 to 379, who on special occasions invaded Britain and took possession of large tracts, so that he is called in our old records Criffan the Great, King of Ireland and of Albion to the British Channel. The Roman historians tell us that Theodosius succeeded in beating back the Picts and Scots and even chased them out to sea, in which there is probably some exaggeration, as there is no doubt on the part of our own historians in calling Criffan King of Albion to the British Channel. Criffan was succeeded by Niall of the 9 Hostages, AD 379 to 405, who was still more distinguished for foreign conquests than his predecessor. He invaded Britain on a more extensive and formidable scale than had yet been attempted, and swept over a large extent of country, bringing away immense booty and whole crowds of captives, but was at length forced to retreat by the valiant Roman general Stilicho. On this occasion a Roman poet praises Stilicho, says of him, speaking as Britannia, quote, "By him was I protected when the Scot, that is Niall, moved all Ireland against me, and the ocean foamed with their hostile oars." End quote. For the extensive scale of these terrible raids we have the testimony of the best possible authority, St. Patrick, who in his confession, speaking of the expedition in which he himself was taken captive, probably that led by Niall, says, quote, I was about 16 years of age when I was brought captive into Ireland with many thousand persons." End quote. The preceding were warlike raids, but no doubt while the main body of the host returned on each occasion to their homes in Ireland, large numbers remained and settled down in Wales. But we have an account of at least one expedition undertaken with the direct object of colonising. In the 3rd century, a powerful tribe called the Daeshi, who occupied the territory of Deshi near Tara, were expelled from the district by King Cormac MacArt for a serious breach of law. Part of these went to Munster and settled in a territory which still bears their name, the Barony of Deishes, in Waterford. Another part, crossing over to Wales under one of their leaders, took possession of a district called Duffed, where they settled down and kept themselves as a distinct immigrant tribe, speaking their own language for generations, till at length they were absorbed by the more numerous population around them, just as, many centuries later, the Anglo-Normans who came to Ireland were absorbed by the Irish. We are told in Cormac's glossary that in those times it was quite a usual thing for Irish chiefs to own 2 territories, one in Ireland and the other in Wales, and that they visited and lived in each by turns, as suited their convenience or pleasure. And the Irish chiefs often crossed over to receive the tributes due to them from their Welsh possessions. Plain marks and tokens of these migrations and settlements exist in Wales at the present day, as we are told by eminent Welsh writers who have examined the question. Numerous places are still called after Irishmen, as for instance Holyhead, of which the Welsh name means the Rocks of the Gaels. The Irish, wherever they settled down in Wales, built for themselves circular forts, as was their custom at home in Ireland. Many of these remain to this day and are called Irish men's cottages. Moreover, the present spoken Welsh language contained a number of Irish words, borrowed by the people from their Irish neighbours in days of old. All this, we are told, as already stated, by several great Welsh scholars. End of chapter. How the warlike old Irish conquered foreign lands, in the story of ancient Irish civilization by Patrick Weston Joyce. The Story of Ancient Irish Civilization by Patrick Weston Joyce. Chapter 3. How kings, chiefs, and people were subject to the Brehon Laws. The ancient Irish had a system of laws which grew up gradually among them from time immemorial, and there were lawyers who made law the business of their lives and lived by it. When a lawyer was very distinguished and became noted for his knowledge, skill, and justice, he was recognized as competent to act as a Brehon or judge. A Brehon was also a magistrate by virtue of his position. From this word Brehon, the old Irish law is now commonly called the Brehon Law. We have seen that every king kept in his household distinguished men of all the learned professions and paid them well. Among these, the Brehon always held a high place, so that a large number of Brehons found employment in this way. But many were unattached and lived by deciding cases brought before them, for which they held courts and were paid fees by the litigants in each case. On these fees they lived, for they had no regular salaries, and there were practicing lawyers also, not holding the position of Brehon, who made a living by their profession like lawyers of our day. To become a lawyer, a person had to go through a regular course of study and training. The subjects were laid down with great exactness from year to year of the course, and the time was much longer than that required by a young man nowadays to become a barrister. Until the student had put in the full time and mastered the whole course, he was not permitted to practice as a lawyer of any kind, pleader, law agent, professor of law, law advisor, or Brehon. Law was perhaps the most difficult of all the professions to study, for there were many strange terms hard to understand, all of which had to be learned, many puzzling forms to be gone through, many circumstances to be taken into account in all transactions where law was brought in, or where trials took place in a Brehon's court. and if there was the least flaw or omission, if the smallest error was committed, either by the client or by his lawyer, it was instantly pounced upon by the opposing pleader, and the case was likely enough to go against them. As soon as the Irish had learned the art of writing, they began to write down their laws in books. There is the best reason to believe that before the time of St. Patrick, the pagan Bretons had law books, but they were full of paganism, pagan gods, pagan customs, and pagan expressions everywhere through them, and they would not answer for a Christian people. So about 6 years after St. Patrick's arrival, when Christianity had been pretty widely spread through Ireland, he saw that it was necessary to have a new code, suitable for the new and pure faith, and he advised Leary, the Ard Rí, to take steps to have the law revised and rewritten. The king, seeing this could not be avoided, appointed 9 learned and eminent persons, of whom he himself and St. Patrick were 2, to carry out this important work. At the end of 3 years, these 9 produced a new code quite free from any taint of paganism, and this book got the name of Seanchas Mór, meaning Great Old Law Book. The very book left by St. Patrick and the others has been long lost, but successive copies were made from time to time, of which some are still preserved. We also have manuscript copies of several other old Irish law books, most of which, as well as the Seanchas Mór, have been lately translated and printed. As the language of those old books is very obscure and difficult, it was a hard task to translate them. But this was successfully done by 2 great Irish scholars, Dr. John O'Donovan and Professor Eugene O'Curry. These translations of the Seanchas Mór and the other old law books, with the Irish texts and with notes, explanations and indexes, form 6 large printed volumes which may now be seen in every important library. The Brehons held courts at regular intervals where cases were tried. If a man was wronged by another, he summoned him to one of these courts, and there were lawyers to plead for both sides, and witnesses were examined, much in the same way as we see in our present law courts. And after the Brehon had carefully listened to all, he gave his decision. This decision was given by the Brehon alone. There were no juries such as we have now. All parties, high and low, submitted to the Brehon laws and abided by the judge's decisions, unless the party who lost the suit thought the decision was wrong, which indeed happened but seldom, in which case he appealed to the court of a higher Brehon. Then, if it was found that the first had given an unjust decision, he had to return the fee and pay damages, besides more or less losing character and lessening his chances of further employment. So the Brehons had to be very careful in trying cases and giving their decisions. The highest people in the land, even kings and queens, had to submit to the laws, exactly the same as the common subjects, and if a king was wronged, he had to appeal to the law like other people. A couple of 100 years ago, when the King of France were, to all intents and purposes, despotic and could act much as they pleased towards their subjects, a learned French writer on law, during a visit to England, happened to pass near the grounds of one of the palaces, where he observed a notice on the fence of a field belonging to the king. Trespassers will be prosecuted according to law. Now this gave him great pleasure, as it showed how the king had to call in the aid of the law to redress a wrong, like any of his subjects. And it gave him occasion to contrast the condition of England with that of France, where the king or queen would have made short work of the trespasser without any notice or law at all. But if the same Frenchman had been in Ireland 1500 years ago, he might have witnessed what would give him still greater pleasure. Not a mere notice, but an actual case of trespass on a queen's ground, tried in open court before his eyes. In those days there reigned at Tara a king named Mac Con, whose queen had a plot of land not far from the palace planted with glasheen, that is the woad plant, for dyeing blue. In the neighbourhood there lived a female brewy or keeper of a hostel for travellers who had flocks and herds like all other breweries. One night a flock of sheep belonging to her broke into the Queen's grounds and ate up or destroyed the whole crop of glasheen, whereupon the Queen summoned her for damages. In due course the case came before the king, for the Queen would not appear before an ordinary Brehon, and on hearing the evidence he decided that the sheep should be forfeit to the Queen to pay for the crop. Now, although the glasheen was an expensive and valuable crop, the sheep were worth a great deal more, and the people were enraged at this unjust sentence. But they dared not speak out, for Macon was a usurper and a tyrant. Among the people who dwelt in Tara at this time was a boy, a handsome, noble-looking young fellow, whom the people all knew by the name of Cormac. But no one in the least suspected that he was in reality a prince, the son of the last monarch, Art the Solitary, who had been slain in battle by the usurper Mac Con. He was wise and silent, and carefully concealed from all who he was, for he well knew that if he was discovered, the king would be sure to kill him. While the trial was going on, he stood behind the crowd, listening quietly, and being by nature noble and just-minded, even from his youth up, he could not contain himself when he heard the king's unfair and oppressive sentence, and he cried out amid the dead silence, "This is an unjust judgment. Let the fleeces be given up for the glasheen, the sheep crop for the land crop, for both will grow again." The king was astonished and enraged, and became still more so when the people exclaimed with one voice, "That is a true judgment, and he who has pronounced it is surely the son of a king." In this manner the people, to their great joy, discovered who Cormac was. How he managed to escape the vengeance of the king we are not told, but escape he did, and after a time the usurper was expelled from Tara, and Cormac was put in his place. To this day, Cormac MacArt is celebrated in Irish records as a skillful lawyer and writer on law, and as the wisest and most illustrious of all the ancient Irish kings. End of chapter. How kings, chiefs, and people were subject to the Brehon laws, from A Story of Ancient Irish Civilisation by Patrick Weston Joyce.